So we're seeing a lot of interesting cases of men essentially just isolating themselves from society. The system called an otaku, who stays in and doesn't go out because they feel so much social anxiety. And there's a bit of a phenomenon where men have been known to marry anime characters and uh, sex toys, sex robots, right, instead of actually finding an actual mate.
Can you tell me a bit about your work and why you're so interested in evolutionary theory and what importance it has for us today?
Right. So I think this requires me to go back to my past as as a young adult. And growing up, I'm from an Asian family, so they've always wanted me to do something prestigious or useful with my life, and I didn't really know what exactly it would be. But I always knew that I've always got this interest in psychology. I'm the kind of guy that people came to with maybe like relationship problems and stuff, and I was somehow always able to give them some kind of like idea or solution on how to deal with it. So I kind of knew like certain tendencies that people have, and I could have my own frameworks for understanding them. And when I went to university, I did psychology, and I realized, oh, hey, you could study all these things in a systematic way. And at some point, I got to know Dr. Norman Lee, so I started working with him. He's an evolutionary psychologist who specializes in mating psychology, and he does things like sex differences and stuff like that. And the more I read into it, so he recommended me a couple of books. One of them, which is a really good book, is The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. So Robert Wright is a journalist, so he writes in a really easily accessible kind of way, so it's easy to read. And when I read it, I was like, holy shit, this theory gives us the answers to everything, right? So I know there's a lot of debates and wars between like the social cultural psychologists and the evolutionary psychologists, right? But I think there's a lot of ways that these two perspectives can be complementary. So in a way, I kind of think of evolutionary psychology as the basis or the foundation for everything else that we see in the world today. All the variations that we see in human cultures, right? These are all different ways that our basic instincts are expressing themselves. So the way I saw it was that evolutionary psychology had the potential to unite and unify a lot of these different ideas or different things that people do or the way that people behave, and it all just made sense to me. So another part of it is that uh, as a young individual with raging hormones at the time, I was also very interested in things like mating, attraction, what makes men and women attracted to one another. So I felt that evolutionary psychology also gave me answers that that I was actually seeking answers for. So this is kind of like where I started, and just one thing led to another, and I did a PhD with Dr. Norman Lee, and ended up just doing all this research on evolutionary psychology, which includes things like meat preferences, sex differences, organizational behavior, as well as explaining how people in cultures behave. Yep, so that's me in a nutshell.
Interesting. You mentioned Robert Wright's The Moral Animal. So what does he say in that book? Why did it impact you so much?
He actually just says everything that evolutionary psychologists have said, just that it was in a way that was very easy to understand. So, as an example, we usually talk about sex differences, right? Or, well, people like to use the word gender differences, but I kind of prefer to use sex differences because gender is kind of like the gender you identify with, but sex differences refers to biological differences between men and women. So, one of the things that in evolutionary psychology we kind of say is that the reason why men and women differ is because of differences in their minimum obligatory investment in terms of the reproductive process. Okay, so I'm just going to gloss over a lot of details here, and some people might not be very happy with some of this stuff. But this, in general, on average, tends to be true that women tend to be more selective than men when it comes to mating, and that's because women have to incur 9 months pregnancy, and they obviously invest a lot more in children, right? They tend to be the ones taking care of kids after they're born. Whereas for men, it's kind of like I'm just gonna produce a bit of sperm, and essentially the man is dispensable after that. So the men's investment in offspring tends to be quite low compared to women's investments. So as a result, women tend to be more selective because they're more careful about who they want to mate with. Whereas for men, it's kind of like more of a quantity game. The more that a man inseminates, the number of females, the more likely he can spread his genes and reproduce, right? So when this theory was told to me, or when I read about it in the book, it was like, oh wow, this actually makes a lot of sense, and a lot of things actually just kind of flow from there, right? Women tend to be more cautious, so they tend to be more risk averse. Men tend to be more risk taking because they have to try and attract mates. If you look at the animal kingdom, a lot of males tend to be the ones that fight for access to females, right? Reproductive access. So all of these things seem to play out in the human world as well. Of course, I will have to disclaim that this is not always the case. There's always going to be exceptions. There's a lot of cultural variation as well, but in general, on average, this tends to be the case. So evolutionary psychology provided an explanation for some of these things that were, quite clear to me.
It's nice that you bring up the sex differences because that is something you've explored in your work a bit. And what would you say to someone who says, okay, wow, that's really interesting evolutionary theory, but in our modern day environments, I mean, we have expansive governments, we have women that can, take care of their children without males, or we have loads of different technologies. Our culture's changed a lot. How applicable is evolutionary psychology and evolutionary thinking to our world today?
Yeah, it's still applicable, although the world has definitely changed a lot. And I think a lot of the problems that we have today is because the world has changed a lot, which we'll get to,
Right.
right? But if you talk about why is evolutionary psychology still applicable? So one common criticism is that how about the influence of culture, right? There's culture has an effect on like how liberal we are, how sexually permissive we are. Um, it's not always the case that women are cautious. Some women also hit on men, right? It's possible for them to also make the first move. But what is interesting is that if you look at cultures all around the world, right, there tends to be this sex difference too, right? So even though there's some variation between cultures, in general, men tend to be the ones that are the ones who are more likely to go forward and try and find a mate, or fight or be aggressive and in the process of attracting a mate, whereas women tend to be the ones who are more cautious. This tends to be true universally, although there's some variation between cultures, but this sex difference is there. Another sex difference is that men tend to care a lot more about youth and attractiveness, whereas women tend to care a lot more about social status than men do. Right. So even if there's cultural differences, right, maybe the world we live in today, people are a lot more liberal, and women can also care about how attractive a man is. But this sex difference, where men tend to care about attractiveness more than women do, and women tend to care more about status than men do, still persists across different cultures. Okay, so these things seem to suggest that there are some universalities when it comes to these sex differences that still persist despite of or in spite of cultural influences. Another thing you mentioned as well is that now that we live in situations or in societies where our welfare is taken care of, so in a sense, women don't really need to care about whether a male can provide for her, right? Especially nowadays, women also obviously are entering the workforce; they can support themselves. But at the same time, women still care about a man's social status quite strongly. So, in a sense, this suggests that there's certain instincts that we have in us that are still persisting despite changes in the world today. Obviously, the world we live in today also has contraception. So, in a sense, women don't really have to care if a male partner will desert them, if she bears children without a partner around. But at the same time, despite these things like modern day contraception and modern day welfare, right, people still have these preferences that are quite deep seated, which probably have been encoded by our genes to make us care about them still.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess the way then I'm understanding how you explain it is that, of course, there are cultural and technological factors that sort of overlay our evolutionary grounding, but that evolutionary roots is still going to have a huge impact, right? And in a way, you're really going to have to look at the interplay between our evolutionary grounding and what technologies like, say, the contraceptive pill do, rather than thinking that, like, say, those kinds of things, like, it's very not obvious, it's very complex, the kinds of ways these things change how we are. I was talking to the evolutionary biologist David Greary yesterday, actually, and he talks about how, in modern environments, the differences between males and females actually can get bigger, and that's because when we have like enough nutrition and things like this, for example, males have their specialty is being bigger than women, and fighting and being able to defend the tribe, but also competing against themselves. And so, if there's not enough resources, that difference can shrink a lot. But actually, when we do, then that's when you'll see bigger differences, and of course, like we see it in that with that, but also like interests in, say, educational things like different subjects, say in Scandinavian countries. So again, all this to say, there's definitely a very interesting and sort of fertile ground to think about what our modern environment kind of does to and interact with our biology.
Right. Yeah. You got cut off a bit there, but I think I got most of
Okay.
what you said. But yeah, that's a really great point that he brought up. This is something that's
Mm.
quite true. We find that in modern environments, the sex differences are actually more pronounced rather than equalized. So there's a bit of an irony. So usually some people have criticized evolutionary psychologists of testing their theories with modern environments, right? How do we know if this is true? If this is a modern environment, how do we know that this actually happened in the ancestral past? But the irony is that, in fact, in modern environments where there's resources, right, the differences and the things that we evolved to be specialized in tend to be more pronounced. So this, in
Mm.
fact, is a way that it's a way for us to argue that modern environments also can be quite useful in terms of trying to understand evolved adaptive mechanisms.
Yeah. And to get in now to a specific way in which there is this mismatch between our modern environments and our evolutionary past, you have some really interesting work thinking about fertility, birth rates, and why people are having less kids today, and some kind of mismatch there. So tell me about that. Why are we having fewer kids today, and how does evolutionary theory explain that?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. That's a huge topic, but it's one that I've been sort of interested in and trying to answer as well. Just a bit of context. I come from Singapore, so Singapore is really low birth rate. We are below replacement fertility. So replacement fertility is 2.1. It's kind of like two children to replace the parents plus a bit of compensatory fertility for any mortality. So 2.1 is ideal to sustain the population, but now a lot of the East Asian countries that are developed, like let's say Singapore, Japan, Korea, have the lowest fertility rates in the world. So we used to think, well, it's just that these countries are modernizing, so one day they just catch up with the West, which is also having a declining birth rate. But these countries have overtaken the West, overtaken the developed West. So the question is like, what's going on here? So I'll go one up on the bit about modernization, right? To also mention that this is a cultural interaction as well. So there's a bit of a culture modernization interaction going on. Okay, so of course, research is research. I'm somebody who doesn't have kids yet. I'm also delaying my marriage and reproduction. So I've had enough space to think about it from my own point of view, where I'm coming from, and how this also might be true for other fellow Asians, and as well as other individuals in modern societies. So a lot of this started when I was, partying in my undergrad days, and I spoke to this um, exchange student who I think was from Spain or something like that. And in the middle of a couple of drinks, I was asking him, so what is he going to do after he, goes back to Spain, after he's completed his exchange program in Singapore? And he said, well, I think I'll take up an internship at a zoo, try and complete my education and get married. So to me, as an Asian person, this was like inconceivable. Like I wouldn't think of getting married without like completing my studies, without getting a job, and then without establishing myself in some kind of career that gives me stability. So this kind of made me realize that there's some cultural differences going on here,
Right.
right?
So for him there, like, for you as someone from Singapore, like you would think your parents and your culture would think you need to get a high paying job, a stable job. But, for him to work in a zoo, it was just kind of seemed like a kind of like, that's not something you can settle down and support a family with, right? It's just completely different.
Yeah, I mean, even if I wanted to do it, my parents wouldn't accept it, let alone
Okay.
maybe my partner as well, because they
Mm.
would be thinking, how am I supposed to afford stuff, right? But this also made me realize that there could be something going on within the cultures. So this made me think about this variable known as social status. So in a nutshell, when it comes to evolutionary perspectives of mating, right, women tend to care about a man's social status. So I was just kind of wondering, like, is the reason why he could go back to Spain and be a zookeeper and still find a mate and settle down is because doing what you enjoy is a kind of status in itself, right? If you take pride in your work and what you do is meaningful, and of course, assuming that where you live isn't expensive, then you could survive and very very well still attract a mate. Whereas in the case of Singapore, right, it made me realize that the sort of things we need to do in order to get the status we need in order to not only attract a mate but move on in life. So this got me thinking. So I started to do some research on this, and there are a lot of different parts to unpack here. But in general, what I'm finding is that in modern environments, we care a lot more about status than we do in more traditional environments. And the reason why is this is because in modern environments, we're made up of like large populations of people. And if you compare it to a more traditional society, it tends to be more sparse. People are not so compact. People are more spread out on the farms that, maybe the nearest neighbor to you might be a mile away. So in a lot of modern environments, people are more competitive as a result, right? You have to essentially fight with a lot of other people for fewer resources, fewer opportunities, fewer job niches. So in the case of Singapore, it's a really compact and condensed country. So this all contributes to things like social comparisons. You kind of feel like you don't have enough status because you're always looking at somebody else who has a nice car, has a better job, and of course, social media also contributes to this, right? We have a lot of unrealistic expectations because a lot of people, nobody's going to put like the worst parts of their lives on social media. So we kind of have an artificial sense of everybody is doing well, so maybe I'm not doing that well. So all of these things contribute to us wanting to, still invest in our status, invest in building ourselves up, and this naturally will then cause us to delay marriage and childbearing. So one way you can get status, of course, is through education. But if everybody has the same level of education, the only way you can get more status is if you further your education, right? So this creates a never-ending arms race towards just focusing more and more on this status building. Another aspect of this as well is that in large modern societies, social status disparities are quite large. If you compare the kind of world we live in today to maybe an egalitarian kind of tribe, right, where you have only like about 50 people to 150 people, the differences between people are not going to be huge. You can't possibly be so rich that you'll be, unreachable to compared to the lowest person in the tribe, right? That in the first place, there wasn't even enough resources to go around to create that wealth gap. But in modern societies, people can now, and modern societies were heralded by, the advent of agriculture. So people could then grow their crops, build their wealth, monopolize niches so they can monopolize the supply and demand of goods and services or goods and supplies of things like crops and wheat, right? So of course, one thing leads to another, and we have today's modern world where you have somebody like Elon Musk who can, have like hundreds of thousands times more wealth than the average person in like the US, for example. So these kinds of status disparities also make us feel more anxious about our social status. We just will never know if we're good enough. And I think all of these things contribute to the need to focus on status, which then comes at the expense of, finding a mate, feeling that you're ready.
Interesting. Okay, like the way I'm understanding is that status is kind of a zero-sum game, and when we compare ourselves to so many different people, like it's just more likely that we're gonna think that our relative status is lower than other people, and I suppose there's like a certain level of status that we'd find acceptable before we could say think about having children, or getting married, right? And it's just harder to meet that, you know.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like, why doesn't that apply though to is a similar problem going on with, like, say, Spain? I mean, I know that Spain also has like pretty low birth rates, if I'm correct. Like, I guess there's probably also a limited amount of like jobs like a zookeeper that are also enjoyable to do, and you can kind of get that alternative kind of status, right? It's whether it seems that there is just kind of a limited supply of status, and there's such a big society. Yeah.
Yep. So there's a bit of variation even within countries. So a large country like Spain would have certain areas in the countryside which are not so status conscious. That would mirror a bit more of the traditional tribal society kind of thing. Um, So to answer your question, I think culture does play a part, and uh, in the case of Singapore, right? So I'm bringing in a couple of other aspects from other areas of psychology, like cultural psychology. So we know that in Asian context, there tends to be a higher focus or greater focus that's placed on achievement compared to other cultures. And a lot of this achievement is grounded in kind of like formal achievements rather than, say, informal achievements. So let me just give an example from some of the research that I'm intending to do, right? That I'm actually trying to get a grant for. I'm trying to show that in Asian context, this thing known as formal status is quite important. So, we know that there's a cultural difference in terms of like social norms. In Asian context, it tends to be more collectivistic, and the reason why it's collectivistic is because people care a lot about relational harmony. So collectivistic cultures tend to care a lot more about relational harmony, and one reason why we like Asians tend to want formal kinds of status is because if let's say you've got like a certification, you've got a degree, right? There's no doubt about the status that's attached to this degree. So there's no doubt about the status that you have in relation to other people. This then helps to preserve the social fabric, so people are more likely to be able to manage their relational harmony because there's no conflict about whether or not you have higher status than I do. Whereas in the West, right, it tends to be more individualistic. So status can be in the form of things like charisma, it can be in the form of popularity, it can be in the form of being humorous, or even dominant. So these kinds of status still put you at a higher standing than other people, but there's a bit of ambiguity with regards to it, right? Not everyone would appreciate somebody who's like charismatic, and dominance is a way that you could get status, but it sort of disrupts the social fabric, so it creates a bit more disorder. So for collectivistic societies like Asian cultures, they kind of like status that is not so disorderly. So status that allows you to unambiguously show that you have status, right? In terms of like certification, in terms of having a high status job, there's no doubt about it. You're a high status person. So these kinds of formal, what I call formal status, tends to take a longer time to achieve, right? If you're trying to get education, you have to invest like a couple of years into it, and if that's not enough, you have to do further education. Everyone's going to try and compete for a high status job in the Asian context. Typical examples would be things like being a doctor, being a lawyer, right? And if everybody is going for these few but highly prestigious jobs, right, it's going to be harder and harder to get into them. So the need to invest more time and effort to try and get that job is also going to eat up into the time that you could be spending trying to find a mate. And a related point to this is that if in a country like maybe in the West, right, like let's say Australia or the UK or the US, there are a lot more jobs that are sort of seen as acceptable. So you could be a nurse, for example, and that's seen as prestigious because it's a meaningful job. I don't see why that should be considered like a low status job. But in Asian context, right, if you're not a doctor but you're a nurse, right, that's considered like not really a high status job. So in a Western context, if you can get a job like a zookeeper or you could be an engineer and get meaning and like get respect from doing that, then you'll still be an attractive individual, right? Women would still find you attractive enough to want to mate with you. But in an Asian context, I think men especially feel the pressure to keep up because they need to get that status in order to find a mate. And another point that I will bring in here is that there's this phenomenon known as hypergamy when it comes to women selecting a mate. So women usually want to mate with somebody who's got the same level of status as them, usually not lower than them. Right? It's kind of like height. If you're a tall girl, it's not like you have enough height for the both of you. You want to have a partner who's either the same height or taller than you, right? So we kind of know that in modern societies, women tend to be highly educated. They enter the workforce. Their status also increases as a result of that, right? So the number of men that they would find appealing would necessarily decrease in number because the number of high status men, at least on par, if not higher, is going to be less and less. So all of these things cause women to also, find that a lot of men not compatible and end up maybe not even mating with anybody at all.
It's fascinating that final point makes me think that not only is like status a problem, and then not only is it like worse in say the collectivist countries rather than individualistic, which is also an interesting point. But then with the females, say in our culture getting more educated, that makes it just so much worse for the men and the men in like say Asian countries, and so like they're doubly sort of in trouble there. How are they going to get enough status to compete against other males? But then in a way, they're not competing against females, but like they now have another threshold to cross, which
Yeah.
again probably wasn't like an evolutionary problem, but like that's kind of a worldwide culture almost now, and yeah, it has pros and cons, but it's very interesting because that again it makes this relative status mismatch even worse. So yeah.
Yeah. Because we have all this, I guess you can call them mechanisms or adaptations to care about status, which worked out in a small tribe in the past, right? You would need to care about your status in order to fit in, right? If you feel like your status is too low, it's probably because you've not been doing enough to, like keep up with the rest of the tribe, or you're not putting in a shift, right? So all of these things are mechanisms that made us care about status. But in the modern context, right, we care too much about status because we feel like we're never enough. Um, yeah.
You
I was
know,
gonna say, yeah,
go.
I can't remember what I was gonna say. So
Okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to it. It's I guess one thing that I maybe don't understand though is that Asian countries, for example, I know China, they are more collectivist rather than individualistic, but I'm unsure as to like because in the past China was prosperous. They have a very high population now. They were like say in the 1500s even richer than say Europe. So how did it work in the past? Why weren't there relative status issues then? Like were there sufficient jobs that were high status? Did the culture change? Like is it because they're comparing themselves like to the rest of the world now, and there's this problem where it was fine when they were isolated, but then as they compare themselves to other cultures, they I'm not sure what would sort of be the answer to that.
yeah, that's a good question. I think that you know, well, give me a second. Let me think about this.
Yeah.
My guess is that in you've talked about like maybe the 1500s or 1600s China, that's still somewhat traditional. And people, especially among the general population, right, wouldn't have had such a difference in their status. You could have an emperor, and then obviously that person is going to have a lot more status than the average person does. But among the average individuals, I think the variation that they have in terms of status disparity is not that high for them to care so much about it. Um, there's also the possibility that, of course, women did not really, I mean, maybe a lot of people were not really educated in the first place, right? So men and women would have been fitting into their more, I guess, the more normative roles when it comes to gender. Men probably are the ones who go into the fields, and women are the ones who work in the house. So all of these things sort of still fitted the mold when it comes to men and women coming together to reproduce and have children. It's not like you have women who suddenly were such high flyers that men couldn't attract them. And this is something that we are seeing more of in the world today. So the thing that I remember that I wanted to say is that if you use Japan as an example, right, the modern day Japan, I think Japan is among all of the East Asian countries the hardest hit when it comes to low fertility. And I think it's partly because they are such a rule abiding, norm abiding country, where men and women have very clear roles on what they're supposed to do. But when women start to go into the workforce and get more educated and have high paying jobs, men did not really know how to deal with that, right? Um, so we're seeing a lot of interesting cases of men essentially just isolating themselves from society. The system called an otaku, who stays in and doesn't go out because they feel so much social anxiety that they don't want to go out. A lot of this is also related to high levels of shame they feel when they are unable to meet societal expectations. And there's a bit of a phenomenon where men have been known to marry anime characters and uh, sex toys, sex robots, right, instead of actually finding an actual mate. So that's a really extreme example, but that really goes to show the extent of what could happen if this plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Japan, like because the way I'm thinking about it, when you say that like in Asian countries, being more collectivist, they want to get those kinds of status that are non-negotiable. You know, you can't like we can't sort of argue. It's not like it's pretty explicit, right? And so yeah, like you know, it's almost. Would you say that if someone tries to get status in like these kind of East Asian countries in alternative ways, it's kind of frowned upon? Like, hey, you're breaking the rules here. Like we gain status through these set ways, but that backfires in say a modern environment because I mean that could imagine that could be very effective because you know you're having people gain genuine skills, right? They can't like you can actually say that in a way makes it less zero sum, so that could be adaptive. But when there is this status mismatch, now yeah, like say in Japan, what are these people that just have no way to gain that absolute status? They're like, what do I do? Um, so yeah.
That's a great point. I think that's a really interesting area for research when it comes to any conflict in terms of the perception of the status of the job, right? So one thing about Asians is that there's in fact you can find um, comedy stand-ups just talking about this. It's like kind of like Asian trope saying that Asians love money, Asians care a lot about status, Asians are really materialistic, which I think to some extent is true. Although of course maybe there's some differences here and there. So one way that an Asian person can compensate for maybe a can compensate for a low status job is to get a job that pays really well. But I think what we also find is that, especially when, well, at least for my generation, because I've still got parents from an older era. For them, even if I was paid really well, but the job is has unsavory aspects, such as like maybe an example in the modern world would be like doing OnlyFans, for example, right? Or if I was highly paid clown, right, would I still be considered acceptable, right? So all these things, there's a bit of a question mark about it. But I think for Asians, this element of face is still very important. So it's kind of like whether even if you're well paid, like there's no dignity in the things you do, right? It also might
Yeah.
be on point. But this is obviously narratives around these things are changing because a lot of young young individuals are going into alternative economies such as OnlyFans. It's becoming more and more acceptable in some sense, or at least there's more conversations about it. So yeah, it remains to be seen how these things play out. But usually, when it comes to OnlyFans, it tends to be not the men, or at least not the heterosexual men who are going to it. So the women who are going to it are obviously making a lot of money, and that would just essentially contribute to the problem of them not being able to find a mate who makes enough money.
Right, it makes the status mismatch even worse,
Yeah.
and yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it's probably not good for males too. Like just I don't know, contributing to like more pornography and things like this. It's like again, it's funny because obviously we've been talking about status mismatches, but there are I guess also like many other technological and sort of cultural things in our culture that make fertility worse. Would you able to speak about any what are things that can kind of other things that compound on this problem?
Obviously, one of the not so recent technological introductions is contraception, right? So contraception now allows people to control how many kids they want to have, do family planning. But we never really anticipated how much of an impact this would have on reproduction around the world. Because if you look at most of the countries that still have a high reproductive rate, it's partly because they do not really use contraception. Like, let's say the Philippines, for example, is a highly religious country. So religion plays a part in preventing people from using contraception because it's kind of like seen as unreligious to do it. So in these kinds of situations, usually fertility is kept really high. But the moment people can start to plan how many kids they want to have, and they can start to think, well, I don't really want to have kids now. I can delay it, and I still want to invest in myself. I want to have a fulfilling career. Uh, so all of these things then now increase the chances that people would just delay and delay and delay it, and some people get to the point where it's too late, and then they can't have kids anymore. So I think a lot of this is also maybe it's just an aspect of our intelligence. The fact that we can think about controlling something that's supposed to be quite natural
Yeah,
uh, really wreaks havoc on a lot of things. So the way I see myself is that sometimes, or maybe not just myself, but people don't have kids. So there's two types of people here. There are those who don't want to have kids. So that's really those who are out of the picture. And then there are those who want to have kids but don't feel ready for it yet. And I think I belong to this group. And this group tends to overthink the process of having children. So usually we find that by right, how it's supposed to play out is that you're not really thinking too much about it. Two people come together and have sex, and then suddenly kids come along. That's really how it used to be in the past. But now people don't do that anymore. We kind of like, yeah, no, am I ready? Do I have the job? Do I have, enough status before we finally decide, yeah, okay, let's do it. But by then, it's too late. And by then you realize, oh, maybe I've got fertility issues. I have to do IVF. I have to do all these things. And then, it's quite discouraging.
It's interesting that we can talk about the pill and contraceptives as being a good thing, and they let people plan and have more choice. But like, yeah, if you look in the evolutionary past, maybe there was a bit less planning, and maybe you could say it's a bad thing. Oh, I had a kid and I didn't like plan for it, but then a lot of people find their lives more meaningful and find like when they're older that they ended up liked that they had kids, and so maybe actually having it by mistake is not a bad thing. It's kind of frowned upon. Oh, you had kids by mistake, but like maybe that's kind of often how it happened. And you're like, okay,
Yeah,
now we're doing this thing, and
I think so.
it
Humans are notorious for rationalizing their decisions. So once you have kids, you start to like just rationalize why it's a good idea to have them. But I mean, of course, there's certain instincts we have that make us bonded to our children and makes it a really meaningful experience. I've always got this case of like my friends who already have kids, and they're the ones who are saying, um, having kids are great because they really have them. So, um, yeah, all of these things do play a part.
it's problematic, yeah, when like Brian Kaplan, the economist, has talked a bit about like just giving arguments like, hey guys, we put way too much time even into our kids. He argues like kids aren't that difficult to raise. Also he says, and like it kind of makes sense, often children care for each other like siblings. And whereas nowadays we feel we need to have parents watching over everyone, and that we need to like a full-time childcare, right? And whereas if they can take care of each other and they can go outside and play, and one thing I think about is there are kind of these negative feedback loops, right? Because now culturally, and COVID made it worse, kids just don't go outside and
Yeah.
play, and so your child then can't go outside because who are they playing with, right? It's like you need there's good equilibrium and bad equilibrium, and it's kind of like and like in a way that's often what I kind of think is more broadly is like happens in our culture with fertility rates falling is like if because one thing I've also heard is that when you're around people that are
Mhm.
having more kids, that you kind of match what your peers are doing, and so
Mhm.
you're like, oh, my friends are having lots of kids, well, maybe I should. But then
Yeah.
if saying I think about in the Asian countries, if people around you are having no kids, and then you're rationalizing it, you're thinking a lot
Mhm.
about it, and you're going, well, like I'm going to be the odd one out now, and
Yeah.
so yeah, and
But
go on.
I think it definitely plays a part. Whether the people around you are doing certain things, because these are like social norms. There's also more and more people just choosing not to have kids and keeping pets as an alternative, and it's becoming more and more acceptable to do that. Um, so yeah, definitely, the social norms play a
I,
part.
yeah, I've heard that in like say Korea, which is where fertility rates are really bad, like there's almost nothing you can do because like fertility rates they're like the rate of change of population. So even if population is still increasing, like just if you look at it like as a mathematical curve, like population seems like it will like plummet in places like Korea, right? And like what do you do when like most of the population is over like 40 and like no one can have kids? Like there is literally no way you can solve it. You're not going to have kids fast enough, even if you suddenly got the fertility rate back up to normal, to replacement. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any good solutions. I know this is obviously difficult questions, and if you knew the answers, then you get paid a lot of money to do that. But what are some of the things that might solve these issues?
So, for my own research about the status stuff, right? I feel like one way to deal with the problem is to first of all like reduce competitive stress. So when people feel less stressed about competition for status, then they should have more headspace to dedicate to other aspects such as maintaining relationships and having children. So the question then is, how do you reduce that stress? There are a couple of possible solutions, some more absurd than others. Obviously, if you try and make a population less dense, that's one way to deal with it. You couldn't possibly just make a population less dense, but you could create perceptions of a less dense population. Maybe including like more nature, more parks where people can go and be in a more natural environment rather than like in a building where everyone's sort of like working the job and competing. Another is to increase, I think, the number of niches that people can actually gain status from. So in the Asian context, at least, the one part of the problem is that we're all trying to fight for very few jobs that are available that are acceptable, right? So if there could be some kind of policy or some kind of campaign that increases the status of jobs that initially were seen as unattractive, then maybe people would be more carefree to pursue other options in life and gain status from them. So let's say there are a couple of like ambiguous status jobs, such as being a physiotherapist, right? If let's say being a physiotherapist could be seen as a high status job, then that would be fine. If you could be a soldier and be seen as a high status person, then that would be good too. Stuff like that. So
Right.
maybe
There's a lot of these. Yeah. Go on.
uh, yeah.
There's
So
a
I
lot
was
of these
just going to say,
there's a lot of these borderline jobs, right?
yeah,
It's kind of like in the Western culture that's actually, can be quite good,
mhm,
and it's like if you just get enough of those, and like that actually could help quite a bit.
yeah. So I think more fundamentally, it's just simply getting people to care more about how meaningful the work they do is, rather than really how it's perceived by other people. So if you're like a plumber or an engineer or somebody who's doing an honest living, that should be seen as like acceptable enough. But that's just not the case at the moment.
It's interesting that you
Um,
bring up. Oh, go on.
yeah, go ahead.
I say it was interesting that you bring up like more rural cultures, like less urban, because you know perhaps as people say work more online and things. I've been reading some articles where like maybe actually things like cities they decline, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because like rural populations they can facilitate more kids. I mean, as well as you say, like as we've been talking about, that's relative status could actually be less of an issue because you're like around fewer people, and it's this dichotomy because the internet and being online to be compared with everyone in the world is such a huge clash of status,
Yeah,
but then the internet and these kind of technologies also could facilitate people living more rurally, and that could actually perhaps help not even just status and raising kids, even like health, like this in some ways, like I can imagine just more generally that being a good thing, that we're able to live more widely and have like bigger lawns for children to play on and things like this. So
yeah. I think for that to happen, people must be more willing to live in rural areas. And I guess I do find that this is the case for people who want to live in the city. They are usually the ones who still are looking for work opportunities, who obviously are more focused on themselves than thinking about having kids. And obviously, it's harder to raise children in a crowded city. So where I'm in Newcastle right now, I found that a lot of people after coming here to start a job, right, they end up settling down and having kids because the environment here is just kind of so conducive to have them. There's less comparisons. I think another factor that I wanted to mention as well is that one reason why we also don't want to have so many kids, right, is because we are concerned about the status of our kids. So it's not just about our own status. Once we have kids in a competitive environment, we kind of like feel that we need to invest a lot of, we have to invest a lot in them to ensure that they are competitive too. So this also creates like a lot of downstream concerns and problems.
this is actually something I've heard Robin Hanson, the economist, talk a little bit about, is that if we are if we're higher in absolute like levels of wealth, like actually that can in a way make it worse because we're thinking like it's a strange irony that people in like poor countries and developed countries in this world they actually have more kids, right? You'd think that they would be less able to have them, but it's like almost as you say, gain in relative status, and you have more wealth. You think, oh no, yes, I have more than many other people, but like it's you feel that competitive world, and you think I need to sort of give my children wealth, whereas you know, but you might. I feel like it's a problem we all feel like we want and need and we deserve to have that really high status thing, and we almost kind of the way Robin Hanson describes it is we kind of feel like almost we're royalty, and that's what people that are very very rich do. They have fewer kids, but we all think we should be very, very rich and the highest, and frankly, that's not possible. Like in a society, there are hierarchies. There is a limited amount. Yeah, it's all like very, very difficult problems, and I
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's a couple of things to unpack there, which I have something to say about as well. Usually, when the resources are low in a place, right, in a society like a tribe, some rural kind of tribe, the status differences tend to be quite low. As the resources increase, right, if the wealth of the area increases, right, it tends to be the case that most of this wealth being monopolized by a few people. So this then ends up creating that stark social status difference that we are talking about. So, so like you're saying, the irony is that in a modern environment where we are supposed to feel well off and we can afford having children, we end up having less children because I think most of us, the normal population, tends to be those who do not have enough resources compared to those who have them. And another point to note is that actually people who have a lot of money still are the ones who tend to have more children. It's just that they are the ones right at the top. Somebody like Elon Musk can keep like reproducing, partly because he can afford it. So I've got this other study which I found that population density tends to reduce birth rates. Okay, so the higher the population density, the lower the birth rate tends to be. This is true like across the world. But I find that this effect is moderated by a person's individual income. So if you are from a high density populated place, if you have low income, you tend to have less children. But if you have high income, you tend to have more children. Whereas in a low density populated area, people generally tend to have a lot of children um, in general. But the difference comes up only if in the high population areas, in the crowded areas. And we find that income does have an effect on this. So
very interesting.
richer you are, the more you can afford children in a crowded place.
Right, it's very interesting to split that up between what happens in different crowded versus not crowded places. I mean, I know like in economics, Paul Romer, this Nobel laureate, thought a lot about how people and ideas are the driver of economic growth. And so having greater population density, like it is good for increasing wealth and increasing prosperity, but then it's fascinating that there's in a way kind of feedback loops that can reduce that. No, I suppose it's good, but the strange thing is that also makes people feel less relatively rich, even though everyone is getting richer in those more populated environments as ideas and technologies are being generated. And that problematic leads to fewer kids, whereas kids were the thing that it's making everyone rich because more people, more ideas, more
Yeah.
economic growth.
So there's some studies in the animal population as well, which could be relevant for some of the things we're talking about here when it comes to population density. We find that animals in crowded enclosures, so there's a lot of experiments that have been done on this. When animals are living in a crowded environment, they tend to slow down their reproduction as compared to animals that are in more spread out areas. So it could be that, while you have a large population of individuals in the human population, right, and obviously this creates a lot of there's a lot of human resources, there's a lot more productivity, there's a lot more ideas that can be channeled towards innovations. But this, if the animal studies are true, then maybe this also creates a lot of competitive stress. So we find that in the animal studies, when animals are living in a crowded enclosure, they tend to be more stressed out. They tend to eat less. They tend to reproduce less as well.
It's interesting when you say competitive stress. So it's like actually at the physiological level, these effects they can actually like. So it's not that you might just have fewer kids. Like, is it just kind of worse for your health and lifespan to live in a more crowded, populated place?
Yeah, it could be. So
Right.
there's two levels of analysis here. One is like, is this sort of like our rational choice? And the other is this some kind of instinct that is inbuilt in us? So it's probably a combination of both of them. Maybe instinctively, we slow down reproductively because maybe we think that no, it might not be so conducive to have kids in such a stressful environment, or you might just want to have less kids because you want to invest in those children so that they are competitive in that densely populated environment. Or could it be attitudes, right? Could it be that living in this place makes me feel like I don't feel like having kids, right? That I think having children is not so good, or having too many children is not a good idea. So there could be something physiological, which could be
Hmm.
terms of the adaptations that we have, in terms of the instincts that we have, or it could be that we are learning from the environment and telling ourselves that it's not a good idea. It's hard to say which one is it, but I think it's kind of linked in
Right.
some way.
It's hard to tell and discriminate, but it's very helpful that you bring up that it's not just the mental status thinking about how we play out. It's also like there might be more deeper biological instincts and things turned on and activated that are harder to instinctively see, and that they're less obvious, but perhaps just as important. I
Yeah.
yeah. I if you wanted to say something, go for it. But
So you go ahead.
yeah,
I
it's
might something to say, but let's see if what you're saying has.
well, no, I suppose I'm very interested in the way we've been talking about children and this mismatch between ourselves and the modern environment versus the evolutionary past. But I'm wondering what other aspects beyond fertility could be noted. I know you've written about body dysmorphia, so and perhaps intrasexual competition, say between women. So would you be able to speak a bit about that? What are some other ways in which there are these mismatches between ourselves today versus in the past?
Yeah. So I think one thing I realized is that we didn't actually contextualize what exactly a mismatch is. So I think it's a good idea to kind of talk a bit about what mismatch theory is trying to say. So mismatch is essentially when you have, we all evolved in a certain way. So we have certain adaptations that help us survive, right? We have a pair of eyes because having a pair of eyes is good. We evolved this way. Um, so we have certain adaptations such as we have a sweet tooth, right? So one reason why mismatch happens is because the adaptations we have not updated themselves fast enough for the environment we're living in. These things were probably suited better for an ancestral environment. So one reason why we have this preponderance of obesity and diabetes today is because we have a sweet tooth, right? If you talk about if you think about how an ancestral person had to survive, right? They needed to have a sweet tooth to motivate them to find ripe fruit to eat. Essentially, things that had the most calories in them, because the higher the calorie count, the more nutritious it would be for an ancestral person. Where first of all, it's really hard to find food sources, right? But in the modern world, we live in, we still have this sweet tooth. It's not like our genes suddenly just decide to switch off and we don't have it anymore. The genes that code for having a sweet tooth are still in us. And in the modern world where companies are able to manufacture tons of sweet and sugary and fatty foods, right? We aren't really able to regulate this eating behavior. So a lot of people are still just eating whatever that's available to them, as if this was the ancestral environment. Okay, so in the past you would have to eat immediately whatever you see that was available because somebody else would have eaten it, or it would have rotten, for example. But in the modern environment, we just eat what we see because we have this sweet tooth. So this, of course, creates a lot of problems like tooth decay, obesity, diabetes, right? So this is an example of mismatch, where the adaptation that we have, such as a sweet tooth, is now mismatched in an environment which is now bad for us. We kind of see this in a lot of other examples, like flies and moths flying towards your light sources in the house because they have been adapted for using the moon to travel for directional sense. But in a modern environment where now you have artificial lighting, moths and flies now fly into your house, fly towards the light, because now there's a mismatch between what they were adapted to do and the modern environment. So this is the idea of mismatch in general. And when it comes to, I think you were bringing up the intersexual competition stuff when it comes to women. Yeah, so when it comes to this mismatch idea with regards to women's body image issues, right? In the modern environment, we tend to have a lot more mass media, where obviously they're not going to show unattractive women. They're going to show women with a certain body image, with a certain kind of physique, right? So if you look at like more traditional societies, where obviously their exposure to mass media is limited, they would have a more healthy sense of what exactly the right body shape should be like. Or in fact, they may not even really care so much about it. Um, so one thing we know is that when a woman has gone through multiple stages of reproduction, so she's been through a pregnancy and she's born children, right? She tends to gain weight. So Anyway, we all tend to gain weight as we get older as well. So all of these things indicate that a woman is a bit older, or at least it's suggestive of it. At least we are naturally we have this maybe natural instinct to know or to sense whether a woman is young or not based on this. So when women are seen as as very thin in mass media and models are all looking very thin, there's this feeling that a lot of women out there are still unmated or at least are still young. So the competition, the sense of competition is enhanced here, is sort of intensified. So this pressures women to maintain their weight, and this can cause women to also feel like the weight that they have is not good enough. Like they're too large, for example. So all of these things like social media all contribute to this, I think.
Interesting. I mean, I guess there's many. I guess there are many things going on. Like one is, yeah, you're just having more exposure to, and it's a kind of only having, say, in media, right? People aren't going to post pictures of people that, yeah, aren't this almost idealistic, perfect body type. And also, yeah, it's fascinating that you bring up the links to fertility, because I would suppose that would also bring us back to fertility issues, right? If, yeah, having pregnancy does increase body fat, right? And like, and if there's so much exposure to that and how the ideal comparison to that, then people also perhaps going to have less kids because of that. So, I've been reading and listening to a lot about, female intersexual competition, and it is very interesting that, you know, I mean, yeah, in a way, female relationships between each other can be quite tricky because they often exclude each other if, someone is too attractive, right? So there's also that kind of element to it where, I mean, that's, I don't know, is that a counterbalance? But yeah.
Yeah, I think female intersexual
It's,
competition is interesting.
yeah.
It tends to be more nuanced, more subtle than male intersexual competition. Men can kind of compete in a very direct kind of way. They can fight, or they can get a better job or get a higher paying job than somebody else. Whereas
Right.
for women, it's kind of like, of course, they can compete in terms of how they look, but they're also competing in terms of whether they are part of a group. So, if you look at movies like Mean Girls, a lot of the ways that women fight, because it's not aggressive and it's not violently and outwardly aggressive. So there's a lot more subtleties involved, right? It's like
Mm.
name calling. There's a lot of inside jokes that people can have. I mean, it's not that men can't have this, but for women, I think it's a bit more complex. In some ways, I'm not sure if I could survive this if I was female. The kind of male mind that I had. Right? So it's, some people might think that men fighting with each other is terrible, right? We can get physically harmed and things like that. But for women, it's just kind of like another level of competition.
Mm. It's it's interesting because we have, on the one hand, we've talked before about the status issues, and that's going to particularly impact men, especially when more females get educated, and females look for people at or above their level in that sort of hierarchy. Um, but whereas women also have this problem now, intersexual competition for them gets worse, and they have more sort of body issues and comparisons. So, is there a way to say who has it worse in our modern environment, males or females? Is any? I guess you kind of come on and like sometimes I don't know. It's a strange one. There's
Yeah,
like many. Yeah.
it's a great question, and I think because men and women differ in terms of what's important to them, it's hard to really say who has it worse. I think in some ways, both men and women have it bad in different ways, right? I think for men, the problem is that the world is coming to a point where only the highest status men can actually get a mate, or it's getting harder and harder for men without status to get a mate. So there's a lot of men who simply can't, who are simply sort of excluded from the mating market altogether because women are not interested in them. So we kind of know like there's a lot of talk about male mental health these days, and I think some of these dynamics have a part to play in them. For women, I think the problem for them is that they can't really secure a mate that wants to stay around. Um, I mean, of course, some people might accuse me of promoting like outdated ideals here, but I think it tends to be the case that women care more about commitment than men do. I mean, eventually when a man wants to settle down and have kids, usually they care about commitment too. But there's also this sex difference where women are the ones who tend to care more about men's commitment than men do. So um, with this in mind, right, women are also kind of not getting what they want because the men that they are attracted to, the high status men, don't really have to settle for them. They kind of can actually get almost anybody they wanted. Um, and
Right.
yeah, this so early on we actually talked about one of these solutions, right? What are some of the possible solutions to some of these problems? And I know of a scholar who has this really interesting idea where he says that we should just move towards non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, where women now are so sort of like so capable that they can actually support themselves and be a single mom and still be okay, like high status, high flying kind of individual. So she doesn't actually really need um, companionship anymore. So she wouldn't in this dynamic or this system that has been set up to resolve this problem. It would be something like people are just coming together just to have sex, right? To enjoy the pleasures of having sex without actually having to settle down with one another. So um, it would eventually be resolved in like kind of like it's similar to some of these animal systems where the high status male gets all the females
Right.
and doesn't commit to any of them, but the females get that relationship or at least that sexual experience with somebody that they believe is high status, and then eventually just raising the kids on their own. So this would be a way. This might be one outcome of the direction we're headed, which in some ways I kind of see it as happening more and more as people get less and less committed in relationships. But the main problem here is that there's going to be a lot of men who can't even find a partner. So this can potentially create a lot of like instability in society too.
Now, it's interesting that you bring up that in a way monogamy might have to kind of break down. And like, I guess, yeah, I even wanted to ask you about that because it's interesting that our culture does have a kind of enforced monogamy and there are many benefits to that. But in a way, with the way, yeah, status mismatches and things are working out, perhaps to have more children, actually, it would be beneficial to kind of relax that so that, if I'm right in thinking, at least females, I think about at least if instead of having hookup culture, could you at least have culture where it's hookup but there's some children, and then females can raise them. I mean, I don't know what that does for males because it's like if females can also, be a breadwinner and work for themselves. I don't know what men's place is there, but yeah, it's again and fascinating that you bring up that it's worse for both males and females. So fewer
Yeah.
males have mating opportunities, but then the females have fewer people that will be willing to settle down that can provide for them. So
Yep. I think a culture that actually may speak to this issue is this tribe in China called the Mosuo tribe. So in this tribe, the females have all the power actually. So they usually it's a matriarchal society where the woman has is usually the head of the household. So all the resources are sort of kept to the woman. And how they actually go about their reproductive system is that they have non-committed marriages. So the man comes over to the female if she's attracted to him and they're attracted to one another. They they have sex, so they commune and they have sex and have kids. And eventually, the father of that child doesn't actually stay in that family. He moves back to his own household where he takes care of his sister's children. So every household is sort of sustained this way because now men are not really needed. They're kind of like almost sperm donors in some sense. And of course, a man can, if he wants to, he can still care for the child he helped to bring into the world, right? But there's no obligation or there's no requirement for him to do so. So this is another system that sort of resolves this issue, especially if the women have quite high status. Then they no longer need the status of the man to come into the picture. It doesn't need to provide any resources whatsoever. If he does so, that's good for him. But if he doesn't, that's fine because all her children will be raised by her family in her family household. And the father figures are essentially the uncles of the child because they will be taken care of by her brothers.
interesting. So there's just you can kind of have like an alternative system of mating whereby the males, so they're looking after not exactly their own kids, but their own. Is it sisters, children?
Yeah.
Would that be right?
This,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
And
interesting that gone.
yeah, and this kind of works because in such a mating scenario, right, men will never really know who their child is because if the woman, I think in this system, the woman is allowed to have as many partners as she wants, has have had as many or as little partners as she wants, right? So they kind of come around and they have this sort of like mating rituals, or I guess periods of time when they would go to a festival and then it's
Right.
kind of like a traditional festival, and then they'll find somebody they're attracted to and mate. So in these kinds of situations, men are usually not sure who the child's father really is. So this creates this thing called paternity uncertainty. So this arrangement that this tribe has deals with that problem, because if I'm a man from that tribe, right, I'm more likely to raise my own sister's children because I'm more sure that they are my relatives, right? Because I know who my sister is. She's going to be related to me, and her child is definitely her child. But I'll never know if that child is mine or not. I mean, that would be my child. But if I was mating with a woman, I'll never know whether that child is mine. So in this situation, uncles are more sure of their relatedness to the child than fathers of or putative fathers.
It's fascinating that in this scenario you're not having monogamy, but you're still getting investment into children by this strange alternative route where
Yeah,
males go, okay, well, actually, I don't specifically care about my children, but my sister's children, and yeah, it's I I mean, I've even been interested in asking you about how, like, why there can be so many different styles, and like when does monogamy work versus polygyny, and and other other various words for describing different sexual mating interactions. So yeah, like why in our culture do we have monogamy, and has it been different in our past?
I think it's been, if I'm not wrong, it's been different in the past, right? Some people might even argue that monogamy is a more recent kind of arrangement, partly
Mm.
because if you look at a lot of animals, animal species, especially mammals, right? A lot of them tend to be polygynous, which means that you have one man to one male to multiple females. And humans traditionally have more of a polygynous arrangement than a monogamous one. So the question about why is there such a variation in different types of mating systems probably has to do with which ones of these systems really work to sustain reproductive success for that culture. If if it helps for women to mate a man who's already mated, right? So this is a polygynous system. Then this would probably be the system that will prevail. So one reason why a woman might want to mate with a man who's already got other wives, right? It's because that man probably has resources. So it really depends on the situation that the culture is in, what kind of ecology it has, whether the man has status or not, uh, whether that status is monopolized by only a few men. Because in such situations, usually women are better off being with a man who has other partners already than meeting with a man who has no resources at all. So it kind of depends, right? Maybe in the modern context where now we have sort of like enough resources for most people to get by, then as a result, men will then have the opportunity to have partners more so than in the past where there's more, how would I say, status disparity.
What do you think of figures like Genghis Khan, that they have so many children and they're kind of this alpha male? Because we've talked about how, in a modern society it's getting worse for males, but I sometimes think, well, actually, is it? Because
Mhm.
probably in that evolutionary past too, you have like loads of peasants that have no children either. Although I'm not sure, like how can we compare our
Yeah,
situation now to in the past?
I think it's because when I gave you the example of like how we are moving towards maybe the high status men getting older women, right, as a way to resolve this problem of how do we increase fertility, right? In some ways, I think we're actually reverting back to that kind of past. Because if you have this huge social status disparities in the modern world, and there'll be fewer men with enough status, this is mirroring the situation where you have an emperor or somebody like Genghis Khan who has a lot of status, getting all the mates because he's beating up all the other men and killing all the competition. And women are then better off just mating with the guy who has that resources or has that power. So in some ways, I kind of think that if I was a man living in that kind of a situation back in like ancient China, for example, where you have somebody that can just come around, that sounds pretty terrible to me. My my chances of reproduction are essentially zero unless I'm born into a family that can afford to give me wealth to attract me. And um, so when I talk about the example of the Mosuo tribe, I think in some ways actually the men in that environment tend to be better off because they no longer have to compete on status. They kind of just you know find a maybe they might have a female that they've noticed, and then they go to the household and then they see whether the female is attracted to them, and they sort of mate based on mutual attraction rather than things like whether the guy has enough status or not. So in such a scenario, the man doesn't really have to compete on status. It means that his well-being is sort of maintained because he doesn't have to fight for the job, doesn't have to stress himself out. He might also be more likely to be selected based on traits such as how attractive he looks, whether he has good personality. So it won't really be on the basis of his resources or status, which then reduces the need for men to compete. So in some sense, those
Interesting.
kinds of environments could be much better for men's health and well-being as well, as compared to today's
Mm.
scenario.
Yeah, it's interesting that in that alternative mating scenario that you bring up, actually, that changes the kinds of men that are selected for. And yeah, you like if you're only getting their sperm, then maybe you care more about like personality and like yeah, how they look and their genetics. Yeah, interesting. I you know we talked about fertility and how people find they find meaning from children. It's a really important part of life, and that's kind of being disrupted in our modern environments. And you talk to me about how of the that about meaning, spirituality, and how we find meaning in this world. So how do you think that changes in the modern environment, given given the present day circumstances?
I mean, how do we find meaning in the world we
Yeah,
live
how
in
do we
today?
find meaning, and if it's more difficult to find to have children, and what do we do with the technologies that we have? How do you think that changes the equation about meaning?
I'm not really sure about meaning, partly because I kind of think that a lot of the meaning we have is self-created. It's not like
Hmm.
there's the true meaning of life that everybody should aspire towards, but it's more like the kind of meaning you create for yourself. So of course, this also depends on the culture you live in. Like, for example, in Singapore, it's quite a materialistic culture. So people's meaning of life would be tied more to the things they own, whether they feel like they're doing well enough in life. I think. Whereas maybe in the West, having something you care about is sufficient for having enough meaning in life. Um, but yeah, I think
Interesting.
having children definitely creates a new kind of meaning for people once they have them.
Hmm.
Uh, and people can have motivations to have children or not. So some of these motivations to have children would be like things like fulfilling some family obligation. Maybe my ancestors will be unhappy with me if I don't have children to bear the family name, right? That sort of thing. So for such people, maybe the meaning of having children would be family duty. Whereas for somebody from a liberal kind of environment, liberal society, would be having children because it's more like maybe for more. Uh, if I would put it this way, it's like more selfish reasons. Like I want to have a child so that I can experience what being a parent is like. So these all contribute to different forms of meaning that motivate having children in different ways. So for the more traditional point of view, having children would be something like I'm now fulfilling my family obligations, but you're also more likely to pass down these obligations to your child as well. Whereas somebody else with a different from a different culture might be thinking, I want to have children because I want to be able to raise them to be independent, and then they can move on and do things on their own. So yeah, different there's different motivations, and as a result, different meanings that can arise from those motivations.
What do you think in our modern day of our rituals or lack thereof? And what I mean by that is things like rituals of growing up, like going to university. The way I guess I picture it is that we used to have lots of different kinds of rituals and like ways to say, okay, now you're growing up, you're a different kind of person. But in a way, we've had to kind of create new ones in our present day culture. And how well do they work? and what is the need for these kinds of rituals? Do you have anything to say on that?
I think it's a bit difficult because I think the world is changing quite a bit. Right? In the past, we have certain
Yeah.
rituals. Like, you have to go to school, and even when you go to, let's say, you go to college, right? There will be certain hazing rituals that were normal to do. But now a lot of things are changing. I don't really have a lot of things to say about the ritual part, but I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
what we accepted that we should be doing in the past are not being done today anymore. So I think the part that I'm going to say here that ties in with, like, once again, fertility is, we live in a world today where we don't really want to pursue those traditional goals that our parents used to pursue. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think. Uh, if you look at the current young generation, right, like Generation Z, Gen Z individuals, first of all, they are not really able to afford a lot of things because cost of living is really high. People can't really earn enough money to own a house, and even rental is really getting very high. So all of these things are causing people to feel like I don't want to really, I want to give up. I want to give up on those goals that the older generation has, and they are trying to impose on me, right? Because I can't afford the things I need to achieve those goals. So of course, one way to protect our own self-esteem, because if I can't achieve the goals that people are expecting of me, then I might think of myself as a failure, right? So one way to deal with that, to protect my self-esteem, is to give up on those goals, to say that those goals are not important. So now you find that a lot of people are not really pursuing relationships, not really, I mean, they kind of might be pursuing like situationships or relationships in a very uncommitted kind of way, and they're not really thinking too much about it. But just even asking them, would you want to have kids and settle down, is like, yeah, I'm not going to think about it right now because I don't have the money, I don't have the resources to even think about it. I'm just going to focus on myself, and I'm not going to work too hard. I'm not going to try and strive for the highest paying job because I probably won't be able to get it. And with the kind of job that I have, I'm probably not going to be able to afford a house. So forget about everything. Right? Just be myself and be happy. So I think a lot of
That's
what we're
yeah.
seeing is breakdown of a lot of traditional values. And I think a lot of this also ties in with, like, gender fluidity, more concern about inclusivity, and more acceptance of diversity as well. So it's a bit like, if I don't adhere to those traditional things, right, I should be accepted for the person that I am too. So there's a lot of rejection of, like, old traditional norms as a result of this.
Interesting. A kind of, yeah, creation of new values. Like if I can't fit into that old system, then and then it's fascinating because okay, fine, but like if those new rituals and those new ways that people find meaning are, to not try and gain high paying jobs or to not have children and families like that, that could be in a way a bad thing, or we just don't know the effects, right? Like when there's large amounts of cultural change.
How about yourself? I mean, like, you're a young individual. How do you feel about the situation today?
Yeah, interesting. I would say that I think I've been looking at personality research. I'm very interested in this model of autism schizotypal, which is like basically a way of thinking about cognitive styles of
Mhm.
focus on detail versus sort of, you could say, focus on broad patterns. It's more associated with creativity, right? And yeah, it's related to autism and schizophrenia. The sort of when those cognitive styles go wrong, they're very most extremes, right? And I would say that people like me and probably also like you are probably more on that schizotypal spectrum where we like big, broader patterns, probably more
Mhm.
creative, right? And
Yeah.
I think maybe still in this present day, places like academia perhaps can facilitate that. But I would say that um, often they are becoming more detail orientated, and you need to sort of hone in on and specialize. And I think about often our modern economy is often very focused on specialization, doing detailed rote tasks. And I think I also, the interesting thing to answer your question is, I think there's a kind of, especially for males, male creative people, I think that's who's hit the most hardest, because where can they find their place? Evolutionary speaking, those people do have a place, right? Changing environments, who can find like a new kind of resource, like these are needed. And our society has become so specialized, focused on efficiency, and that's not a bad thing. But that actually, and maybe for me, I'm not I'm concerned, obviously, but it's I do think that increasingly I have pursuits that I can sort of manifest those kinds of traits that are inherently suited in me, like a podcast. But
Yeah,
I do think, like, especially for those kinds of people, be very difficult. I don't know what you think about that.
yeah. I think that the world is moving towards. I think the word you use is specialization. I think it's moving towards a lot of efficiency. Right? There's a lot more. Even like social media, you can look at how many likes you've got as a way to gauge like how popular you are. A lot of these things quantify success, allows us to quantify success, creates a lot of like new kinds of stress, where you can now very easily say, are you a popular person? Are you good enough? Whether it's true or not, that's this second. That's another issue, but it does have an impact on how we feel about ourselves. And I think I'm just wondering, like for young people, there's a lot more focus on like the numbers when it comes to achievement. You can easily see how many people are following you. Um, yeah, a lot of things are more quantifiable today. And I think maybe some of these things also contribute to the anxieties that people have. Um, I think you brought up this question about technology a couple of times, and I guess when it comes to an obvious modern day technology would be like dating apps, right? So it definitely has an impact on the way that people try and find a partner. Um, you're definitely exposed to more people than you used to if you didn't have these dating apps in some kind of a tribal society or an ancestral kind of environment. So this also has an impact on like your the perception of choices you have, whether you want to settle down. It's kind of difficult to decide that okay, this is the person I want to be with. And all this modern technology also creates like all these issues like ghosting and people are afraid to commit. You can kind of text and you don't want to show your hand too soon and stuff like that.
Interesting. It's Yeah, to me it seems that there's a kind of just bombardment of complexity. Like I don't use social media that much, and I sometimes think should I use it more? Because as you say, like there are ways of competing on status in that, right? And and yeah, what we have probably no idea, how social media and dating sites, like, what they do in the long term, right? And I'm only 22, but it, for me, I sometimes feel not old, but like technology is changing so fast. You think about like large language models and things like this. Like I wonder what like children growing up with these, they're probably they're gonna have completely different possibilities. They're gonna use these things completely different to me, and I'm still incredibly young. So like even just a broadly rate of change seems
Yeah,
kind of incredible. Yeah.
it's incredible. And if I had a child, I wouldn't even know if I can advise them on ideas about mating
Mm.
in that generation. I have no idea what that's going to be like.
I think more
And
broadly, like yeah, go on.
yeah, basic technology is just changing at such a rapid rate, and I can totally see why you think that you might feel old because in the past maybe a technological cycle would be like 10 or 20 years, but now it's like every 3 to 5 years something new comes up and things are changing.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I sympathize more and more with like parents who like struggle to use like phones and things because it's like I have an adversity to even try out like the newer things coming out, right? I like it's like enough time for that, and I'm happy with the things that I use, but then that makes me go, hold up. I'm criticizing my parents for
Mhm.
not being able to use their phone correctly, but then how outdated am I going to be if kids now are growing up with the kinds of technologies that they are? So
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the future, from the way it's looking, right, in theory, we're going to move towards a future where we are going to be more immersed in a virtual world. Um, if you think of like a phone, for example, as an interface that allows you to do something with it. So let's say I want to communicate with somebody who's, speaks a different language from me. The way to do it would be to type in something and then get it translated and then speak to that person, right? But I imagine the future where now these kinds of gaps in between the process, right, are actually removed. Where now you can probably be in a world where you can speak, and immediately after you speak, the language is translated for you for that person to understand. So these kinds of lags or lapses, right, would be shortened more and more. We're also going to be able to sort of connect somebody mentally, probably a lot more easily, right? Right now, it's kind of like when I talk to you, I only know what you're thinking of because you're telling me what you're thinking of. But in the future, there could be some kind of cloud system where what you're thinking of is already out there and I can see it immediately. So these kinds of connectivities are going to be more and more, well, they're going to be more connected, and the lags between the translations between these things are going to be minimized.
Interesting. I've really enjoyed this podcast, Jose. So, are there any topics that you wanted to cover that we didn't? Any last things that you want to say?
Maybe just a little bit about that meaning of life, because I think I didn't really do it justice when you
Go
brought
for it.
it up. I think that even if, let's say, meaning of life is artificial, I kind of believe that we kind of create our own meanings in life. I still think it's really important because meaning gives us purpose. So somebody who has no meaning in life, would be probably worse off than somebody who has some meaning, because the meaning gives us a sense of what we should be doing. It gives us direction. It allows us to understand what our identity is. So let's just say if you're comparing two people at a job, right? And both of them are doing something really boring and they have to keep doing it over and over again. It's kind of like the myth of Sisyphus in some sense. You could keep doing the same thing over and over again if you believe that it has some purpose. Like, maybe I'm doing this really boring job because I have to support my family. This person is going to persist more than the other person who has no meaning whatsoever. So even if it's artificial, I think meaning is still quite important. And I think we are evolved to try and create meaning where there's none. So um, this this are some of the stuff I actually write about in my work on rationalization. But yeah, in a nutshell, I think we do create meaning, even if it's not really a true meaning. Like even the meaning is made up or it doesn't really make any sense. But if the meaning is there, it does help us uh, have direction and purpose.
Awesome. I didn't realize you had a book. I need to read that. Probably should have read it before we did this, but I'll put that in the description and some of your work. And yeah, a paper. Okay, well, you have some great papers on a range of different topics. So I'll put a link to some of your website in the description, and I would encourage people to look at some of the articles that interest them, because there's stuff on evolutionary theory on like a range of different topics, and I've enjoyed reading it, and I didn't even have enough time to read all that I wanted to. So maybe we'll do this again sometime, Jose. So
Okay, sounds good.
thank you.
Thanks so much for me, Jack.